Hi everybody, Kate. Today we are going to discuss the experiment that I've been discussing that I would like to perform that should help demonstrate ontological mathematical thinking, or it would be an experiment which you could only explain with ontological mathematical thinking. So that'd be really good. It'd be an experiment which would be really hard to explain, like the results of it would be really hard to explain or couch in terms of the prevailing, scientific materialist, which doesn't believe in materialists. I mean, it's so funny, right? Scientific materialism, they actually don't even believe in matter, but they do believe in matter, right? Matter is just an abstract wave equation, so matter isn't real. But on the other hand, the only thing that's real is matter that you can touch. I mean, it's all just so incoherent, right? So we want to develop a coherent system of thinking that gets around probabilism and solves the probabilism stuff and returns rationality and reason to science, yeah? And I think I know the experiment to do it because this experiment is not explainable and they've left it out purposely. Okay, let's get into that. So, an experiment to demonstrate ontological mathematics, rejecting spooky probabilism. And so this is applied ontological mathematics. So let's review idiotic midwit complexity because this is what we want to get rid of. So I forget where, I don't even remember where I found this. And I've not read this book. I don't even know who this guy is, but this is a great quote. So he says, an idiot admires. So this is what's happened with, first of all, with Einstein and the simultaneity paradox, as you can read about in my book, Debunking the Simultaneity Paradox and Solving the Double Slit Experiment. I'll have a link to that at the end. Einstein invented something, the simultaneity paradox, which makes no sense and is completely self-contradictory. And then that sort of paradoxical self-contradictory thinking is then what then fed into and was justified as a method of thinking and solving problems in quantum mechanics. So this all started basically with Einstein. He's the one that introduced this kind of thinking into science. So an idiot through the simultaneity paradox, of course. So he took relativity theory is generally all valid, but what Einstein did is he basically hijacked it out of the European scientists who had already developed basically the whole thing. Poincaré, Lorentz, Fitzgerald, and there were others. Who are the others? A couple of big names that you would know. Anyway, a few of them. You can look them up. I have them referenced in my book, actually. So Einstein hijacked this, and his really only main contribution was to introduce this simultaneity paradox thing, which introduced the idea that things can be two different things at the same time. Basically, there's no objective reality, right? Is what he got rid of. He got rid of objective reality, and then of course, he complained that that's what quantum mechanics was doing, but he already set that up. Einstein had already set up getting rid of an objective reality with his hijack of relativity theory and the introduction of the simultaneity paradox. So, idiotic midwit complexity. An idiot admires complexity. A genius admires simplicity. A physicist tries to make it simple. So, of course, that's not true anymore. Maybe in the past it was true, but that's certainly not true anymore since Einstein and the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Now it's anything but, and we'll get into that. So aside from that, anything that is gaining complexity, the more the idiot will admire it. If you make something more clusterfuck that he can't understand it, he will think you're a god because you made it so complicated that nobody can understand it. See, that's what the midwits fucking love. The midwits love that, right? That's how they write academic journals, to make others think that they are a genius. Yeah, exactly, right? And the midwits love that, and that's why the midwits are going full bore, like in the university system where I used to work, University of Calgary, right in STEM, right in core physics and astrophysics. There, every day there's emails. I still am on the email list, and I see emails once a week. There's emails. How can we get transgenderism into astronomy and physics? And because it's so clustered, because there's no definitions, right? There's no definition anymore of male and female biology doesn't exist anymore. So it's just, it's a clusterfuck of nobody can actually understand it, right? And you might step on a landmine at any random moment when you say the wrong thing, but it's unpredictable what you're going to say. Anyway, it's all just such bullshit, right? But that's what midwits love. Midwits love the undefinable and the ununderstandable because it makes them feel smart. And then because they instinctually know or something that nobody can understand it, well, then they're con men, right? They're just cons. The midwit is a parasite and is a con and pretends to know stuff and pretends to be smart when they're just, bullshitting and they don't actually understand a damn thing, right? Okay, so, yeah, great quote. The midwits love idiotic complexity. that explains nothing, right? It actually explains nothing, right? Just like I said at the intro there, right? So it's scientific materialism. All they believe in is matter, although all matter is made by an abstract wave equation that's not real and probabilistic and isn't defined or anything, and is only real when it's observed. So that would imply that the mind is important, but the mind is only made of matter. Like, it's all just so completely incoherent, and they love that, right? They love it, right? So we're going to develop a new system which is coherent. Yeah, good. And they've done this on purpose. Actually, I'm going to get into that. So cognitive disparity, this is a term that, because I've been talking about cognitive dissonance, and in my book Planet Wars, I've talked about how cognitive dissonance has actually been instituted as a way of thinking, right? And this is a result of Einstein's and the simultaneity paradox in his hijacker relativity theory. So it's the state of mind where paradoxes are preferred explanations instead of non-paradoxical explanations, right? So they prefer paradoxical explanations. And that's how, for example, they can do flat earth and climate science, climate catastrophism science. It's based on flat earth theory, but they see no problem with that because it's paradoxical to empirical reality, and therefore it must be valid because it's so clusterfuck and makes no goddamn sense that they think it must be true. Like, really, that's how their minds are working now. Isn't that amazing, right? So paradoxes are preferred explanations. That was instituted by Einstein, continued with the Copenhagen QM, despite Einstein pretending he didn't like that. He was the one that started it. Instituted cognitive dissonance has replaced rationality with a new hyperreality of cognitive disparity. So that's where differences are not different and similarities are not similar. It's a kind of idea. Things can be two different things at once. For example, with both with Einstein and the simultaneity paradox and with quantum mechanics and the double slit experiment, photons can be two different things, two different places at once. Earth is not empirically flat, but it can be in physics and math for climate catastrophism. That's okay. And the paradox there and all the math paradoxes and physics paradoxes that are created from that is fine because, hey, relativity is based on paradox, and so is quantum mechanics is based on paradox, so why not have the paradox of flat Earth being the base of climate catastrophism, right? There's infinite refutations of climate catastrophism, climate alarm, but it doesn't matter, who gives a shit, right? I mean, there's infinite. There's literally any number of vectors to destroy this climate catastrophism claims and what they're doing with it politically, but it all just, it doesn't matter because they like the paradox. The midwits prefer the paradox of it all. And of course, this is all being done on purpose, as I've explained in Planet Wars. It's all actually being done on purpose. Most of these people are NPCs. They're being controlled by some outside, what seems to be hostile alien or foreign force of some kind that has, they basically want to enslave us and basically destroy the planet or something, it seems. So it's the cessation of thought, the total destruction of mind. This is designed and intended. It's designed and intended. They're doing it on purpose. They're doing it to us on purpose. And they know that they're doing it on purpose, to us on purpose, and they know exactly the retarded explanations to give us to dazzle, the midwit minds, the hordes of humanity, plus their NPCs who they have programmed to promote it and defend it, right? In their stupid peer review system, they got all their people in place to not allow rational discussion go through, and then they claim that peer review is the only valid way to do science. Of course, you people have read Hockney and you know what the actual philosophical intellectual position is on peer review. It's not a standard of truth. Peer review is not a standard of truth, full stop. It's just not. Peer review is good maybe for editing, grammatical errors, basic mistakes. If you say that a proton has a negative charge, oops, proton is positive. Yeah, that's what peer review would be good for. As a standard of truth, it's not a standard of truth. It's not. It's no sort of philosophical standard of truth or reason or rationality or anything. And actually, I make some good points about that in my book, Planet Wars. Okay, so the setup. So here's the setup. Here's the ruse, right? So single slit to double slit ruse. So here's the single slit experiment, and then here's the double slit experiment, right? So single slit experiment. Photons interfere with other photons as they pass through the slit together. Okay, that makes sense. So what you have is diffraction. You have photons going through this little gap. The photons diffract, which means that they bend around these edges a little bit. And then the different photons, like one bends this way and one bends this way, and then just the waves. It's not shown here pretty well, but anyway, what happens is that the photon waves, either constructively or destructively interfere with each other, and that gives you the interference pattern. So first thing you have is diffraction. Second thing you have is interference after the diffraction which is those waves either canceling each other out or building each other up, which gives you the interference pattern, right? And so the way you imagine that is that multiple photons are going through together at the same time, and so they're doing that to each other, right? As they pass through together. So double slit, same as above. Okay, so it's easy to explain. Same as above. A photon goes through here, and a photon goes through that slit, and the slit to the two slits, and then they do the diffraction and interference with each other thing because they're going through at the same time. There's a lot going through at the same time, right? Oh, but then interference still occurs when one photon at a time. So how do you explain that? If one photon at a time is going through this double slit, right? Only one photon is approaching this screen where there's either one slit or the other slit, you still get the interference pattern. So how could that possibly work? And then this is where they go, ooh, isn't that spooky? Isn't that probabilistic? Isn't that unreal? Doesn't that mean that photons are unreal? Doesn't that mean that existence is paradoxical? Just like the same with the simultaneity paradox. And doesn't it mean that existence is meaningless? Ooh, the photons have went through two different slits at the same time. That's so meaningless. Ooh, that's so probabilistic and unreal. Ooh, nothing is real. Oh, you don't have a soul. Oh, life is meaningless. Oh, just give up, right? Life is pointless and meaningless. Ooh, because photons went through two different slits. Fucking idiots. Bunch of fucking morons. Isn't that it's just so fucking retarded. Anyway, so what's been left out? What permutation is missing? What did they leave out? They conveniently left something out of the story. What's a missing permutation? What's the missing permutation in this logic? What has been left out? Oh, what happens when one photon at a time goes through the single slit? That's what's left out, right? Why did they leave that out? How come they never talk about that? How come they never talk about, all right, so they have multiple photons at a time going through single slit and double slit, and then they just focus on one photon at a time through the double slit. Oh, but what happens to single slit and one photon at a time, right? They just focus on the double slit thing so that they can pull this probabilistic bullshit, nihilism bullshit for some reason. For some reason, a photon going through two slits at once, according to their logic, means that existence is meaningless and that you don't have a soul, and that existence itself is paradoxical. Anyway, so stupid. So that's a missing permutation in that logic. They didn't go back and say and examine what happens when one photon at a time goes through the single slit. Then what? So then what? And how are you going to explain that? Okay. So single slits matter. So there's your single slit thing set up. And so you never hear about the single slit, single photon case. So single slit with a single photon at a time coming through. How come you never hear about that? Has it even been done? I've been in science my whole life. I've been reading about quantum mechanics and, this whole probabilistic interpretation all my life. Hockney obviously has covered it endlessly from several, but I've never ever heard anyone talk about single slit, single photon. Has it ever even been done? I'm not sure it's even actually ever been done. Why not? You would think that's an important thing to do, right? Just to check that out. So single slit still requires diffraction and interference to create an interference pattern. So here's an important point, and I had this in my last book. Whatever happens when many photons pass through together at the same time where you think that they're interfering with each other, and you get an interference pattern. So whatever happens to produce the interference pattern then must be the same thing when one photon passes through at a time to get the interference pattern, right? And vice versa, right? So whatever's happening when one photon passes through at a time, like in the double slit experiment, to get the interference pattern, that must be the same thing when there's actually the same thing, the same mechanics is occurring to get the interference pattern as when a bunch are going through, right? Has to be the same process. So how do you explain that, right? So thesis, the single slit photon, the single slit, single photon case must still produce an interference pattern, right? It must still. That's never been demonstrated to my knowledge. But the thing about that is that you can't pull that spooky paradoxical nihilism bullshit explanation as easily. It quickly gets retarded and falls apart as an explanation, right? So here you have the double slit, and so they just like, oh guys, when one photon goes through at a time, when there's only one photon present passing through this apparatus at a time, and you still get the interference pattern, oh, well, that must mean that the photon is passing through that slit and the other slit's passing through both slits at once, guys. Isn't that meaningless? Doesn't that mean that you have no soul? Retards. Or it's a probability wave. There's no photon. It's just a probability wave. of interaction. It's a probability wave then that's interfering with itself. And so how does what's the ontological existence of a probability wave? I mean, what is it grounded in? What does it exist in? What's it made of, right? Well, of course, that just gets into the abstract probabilistic spookyism, right, that they love. But you can't pull that as easily when you have a single slit, because how are you going to say that there's the one photon going through the single slit, what's it doing then? It's splitting into two, and A here is actually on the order of a wavelength. So there's actually no room for a single photon passing through here to split into two photons and then interfere with itself, or to become a probability wave or whatever. It just quickly breaks down as an explanation, right? So what would be the explanation then for a single slit, a single photon going through this single slit experiment, a single photon at a time, going through the single slit experiment and still getting the interference pattern? So the first thing would be to demonstrate that interference pattern still occurs with a single slit, single photon at a time, and then explain how can that happen. And you're not going to be able to use this stupid probabilistic thing where the photon is becoming two different photons, or it's becoming a probability field or whatever, right? You're going to have a true ontological explanation of it, or something better. At least obviously we want to go to a true comprehension of reality, right? With that. So experimental ontological math, we basically need to redo the fundamental elements of modern physics in an ontological interpretational paradigm. So basically, where does modern physics start? It starts basically with figuring out what these experiments mean. That's basically where it starts, is with something like the double slit experiment, the interference pattern, figuring out the wave nature of a photon and how that has its results. It's basically one of the major underpinnings of modern physics. And it started to fall apart, as I said, with Einstein and relativity, and then subsequently after that with quantum mechanics. So we basically need to restart all that, go back to then, and redo these experiments, and do them ourselves, because you can't trust, at this point, you can't trust scientists. We know that they lie and they manipulate data and they fake data, as they're doing with the climate stuff. They're manipulating the data, and they're just outright faking the data, fabricating the data. They're just not trustworthy. You just can't trust them anymore. So experimental demo, single slit, single photon at a time. Explain how and why the interference pattern can still develop. And then you extend that to the double slit. That would be the proper rational way to do it, to have a consistent explanation for both, right? And yes, sure, the prevailing methodology works where you do this probabilistic statistical approach. However, that's only a statistical approach. It's not an ontological comprehension, right? Right? There's no comprehension of what the wave equation means, if it's real, if it's abstract, what it is, right? And it's based on cognitive dissonance, right? So is the photon going through two different slits at once? How can an object, a thing, be in two different places, two different slits, separated spatially laterally at once, right? So it's not an ontological description or a comprehension of reality. So how are the midwits going to respond to that? They'll be like, you can't say it's real, it's defined, and it's understandable. You can't say that, it's all just probabilistic, right? They would just repeat the narrative to you, right? So to that, I would just say, yes, we can do those things because fuck you, that's why. That's our only answer, and that's the only answer we're going to give. Yes, we can say that it's real, that photons are real, that they're defined, and that it's all understandable rationally, because fuck you, that's why, okay? That's the only explanation you get. Go fuck yourselves, assholes. So reject cognitive disparity. Reject cognitive disparity. So photons, they're fundamental particles, they're real, discrete, they're definite, they can only do one thing at a time. And actually, they're really real. They're base energy circlings probably. How could they're fundamental particles anyway, right? How can they interfere with each other when one at a time? So what's the thing about photons? Photons are traveling at the speed of light. So what is the experience of reality of existence traveling at the speed of light if you're a photon, right? This is the gamma, the length contraction time dilation factor, right? So if V for a photon is C, then you just have 1 minus 1, 0, so an infinite, right? So spatial distances for photons along their integrated vector of travel is infinitely length contracted, right? So there is no distance for a photon, and photons don't experience time either, because time is infinitely dilated. So photons experience neither time nor space. Existence as a photon is very different than how we experience. We experience existence basically at zero speed. We're negligibly close relative to the speed of light to zero speed. Photons, however, are obviously locked at the speed of light, and the way you interact, or the way existence appears at the speed of light, is completely different than how we experience, right? How we experience it. So for a photon, there's no time nor space, right? Their observer is defined as part of their life history. I got into that in the book, Debunking Simultaneity Paradox. Their eventual observer actually has to be defined part of their life history, because for a photon there's no distance, there's no time. So as soon as a photon is created, there's no length and there's no distance basically between, from its perspective, from its source to its observer, right? Its eventual observer. No time and no space is required to get to its observer. So their life history is always totally determined. So in the given experimental configuration, all photons exist timelessly and spacelessly in that in the lifetime of that configuration. So there's no spatial distance and no time. So resolution, then this would be the thesis, right? For the experimental results, a photon does not exist in time. Of course, this is known. Everyone knows that. That's often discussed. A photon does not exist in space. It's spaceless, experiences no space. Doesn't exist in time, does not experience time, right? For a given configuration for which all photons have a defined reference frame, they interact timelessly and spacelessly with each other. You still need photons. So how do you get a wave to create an interference pattern? You need another wave. That's the only way. The only way to get a wave to create an interference pattern is to have it interfere with another wave, right? That's the only way to do it. So what photons then, right? If one photon only ever went through the experiment, all you would ever get is just a dot on the screen on the camera, and that's it. You wouldn't be able to see anything. You need tens of thousands or millions of photons built up to give you what the signal actually looks like, what the interference pattern looks like. So you need multiple photons to interact with each other, to interfere with each other to build up that interference pattern. So if there's only one photon going through at a time, how do you get photons to interfere with each other, right? Well, it's because photons don't exist in time, so they're interfering with the other photons just across time, right? So a photon experiences a space-time configuration where all the other photons of that context exist too. Hence, they still interfere with each other. So they are interfering with each other, just how we think of when there's a whole bunch of photons at once going through. It's still actually like that for a photon, because a photon doesn't experience time or space. So all the photons that were part of that experiment across time are still just all bunched together in one configuration for all of the photons. So they still just interfere with each other across time, right? So they interfere with each other through time along their integrated vector of travel. And this explains some of the things like the quantum eraser experiment. It would go towards that, and other things where it seems that there's information being passed from photons in the future to photons in the past or something like that. There's yeah, I should have had a reference for that. Anyway, there's been experiments like that lately discussed. So anyway, this would explain it, and it's consistent with relativity theory, and it's just a more consistent and easy explanation, actually, right? So application, an eventual future application would be possibly this. So due to the Doppler effect of photons changing reference frames, they're changing their frequency or wavelength relative to its source frame. So if you have an observer frame that's moving at some relative velocity, then that photon is going to be Doppler shifted. And so, for example, a red laser in the source frame would be 635 nanometers, but in the future observer's frame, if it had a relative velocity, there'd be a change in momentum of that photon, would have a different momentum because its wavelength would change. Its wavelength would be either red shifted or blue shifted, right, away from 635. So the thing is, the observer would have a change in momentum, but the change in momentum wouldn't correspond to a 635 nanometer photon. It would be the blue shifted energy of the photon or red shifted energy of the photon. So it would be slightly different. So that would tell you, right, something about the state of the eventual observer of the photon. It would tell you the state of something about the future state of the observer, of whoever's observing that photon, right? So what that should lead to is a method to engineer instantaneous communication across any spatial distance. That's what it should allow you eventually to do, because you should be able to have that information right away. As soon as you emit a photon, you'd be able to feel, or not feel, but measure by some technique a change in momentum of whatever your source is. Somehow maybe there's a way to measure that, and that would tell you the state of the observer, who actually, in our space-time experience, only observes that photon in the future, but you have that information at least of its relative motion, right away, because you experience, or the source experiences, a change in momentum that would correspond to the relative velocity of the observer. That doesn't happen in your experience for a while, but the photon has to share that information right away. So it should allow something like that, should allow some sort of method to engineer instantaneous communication across any spatial distance. That'd be a future application. I think that should be one of the easiest things to do, first with ontological mathematics. And if that doesn't seem like that's a big a deal, trust me, that's a very big deal to be able to engineer something like that. That'd be very cool, very neat, and it would be revolutionary, and would be pretty cool. So yeah, so that's the experiment. Single photon at a time through a single slit, and the thesis is that it should still produce an interference pattern. And then the problem is, how do you explain how it still produces an interference pattern when you can't pull the single photon is splitting between going through both slits at once in some sort of probabilistic field fashion, which destroys, any sense of reality, right? So here we restore reality to something definite, and we're just doing what the equations say, and what in fact everyone already knows is the experience of space-time for a photon, is that a photon doesn't experience space or time. Well, if it doesn't experience space or time, then that means that all the other photons, all in this vector of travel, have to be there too for a given material configuration, right? If it doesn't experience space or time in that configuration, then everything else that would exist in that configuration must exist too. And you could experiment with that too, right? You could see how you could mess with that, or try to, mess that up, that situation, and see how you could affect it to change the results. Anyway, so that'd be the experiment to do. So guys, please, if you want to support this work, so I think I'm the only one doing it. There are a few books being written still, but they're not covering anything like this anymore. I'm the only one extending ontological mathematics into science, doing actual real-world practical applications. So for example, we've solved climate change. We've totally debunked climate change, and totally debunked the whole modern. I know this sounds so ridiculous. People are like, oh, you're one person that did it. Well, no, just read what's happening. I mean, it's done. Climate change really unravels the whole of the scientific materialist edifice, and if it doesn't, the world is going to pay for it, because what we're going to do with flat Earth climate science is destroy the environment in order to stop the environment from changing, from having a climate change, which always happens naturally anyway, right? So yeah, very good opportunity there. So yeah, there's PayPal, there's Give, Send, Go. Yeah, I'd love to develop a whole new curriculum, right? We're going to teach reason and rationality. My phone is just having a spam call. Let me cancel that. Okay. A true education system, which is going to restore reason and rationality to humans. We at least need to start with ourselves. We need to start with just a place, sort of an island, a mental island of reason, a locus of rationality, because with the world going so crazy, at least in the West, I don't think other countries are probably suffering like as much as we are. There really seems to be a target on the West right now. Basically all the European countries, any white country is under attack right now in terms of reason, rationality, stability, everything like that. So we want to provide a sort of locus of stability around which we could recongregate, sort of. And Illuminism and ontological mathematics offers that locus. And so we really need to, and I want to, and I will be spearheading that movement to create such a locus, sort of a, I don't like to use the term safe space, but I guess it kind of works. We kind of need, a safe space for reason, rationality, and logic, a safe place where we can say, no, you know what, we're going to go with reality is comprehensible, comprehensible, understandable, and rational, and we're going to discard the whole paradoxical view of existence, including all of the woke views and critical theory views and all that. So we want a locus, an island of mental stability is what we want. And hopefully we can survive and bring reason into the future, because my God, the West is a really bad place right now. Yeah, so a new school. So here's my books. Related to this slideshow, then you might want to read Debunking the Simultaneity Paradox and Solving the the double slit experiment. So I discuss I discuss enough in there. I don't perfectly make it clear that this would be the experiment to produce. But I mean, if you know what you're reading and know what you're doing and have some experience in physics, you would have been able to figure that out yourself probably. But anyway, if you haven't, now you know. That'd be the experiment to do. Single slit experiment with one photon at a time. And the thesis is that it should too still likewise produce an interference pattern. And if it does produce an interference pattern, it's much more difficult to apply that probabilistic photon is doing two different things at the same time in two different places at the same time, probabilism, statistical probability field, whatever it is, approach that they currently use, right? You'll have to use something, we have it, ontological mathematics. We can start applying that sort of thinking and that sort of reason and rationality, because it's totally consistent. There's nothing at all that's that's spooky, that's weird, that's stupid, that's paradoxical, that's like, ooh, this is so ununderstandable. Only midwits can understand this, and that, and then make themselves feel so smart because what they're actually talking about is not understandable because it makes no sense at all, right? So this explanation would actually make sense. It's totally consistent with the laws of physics as we know them, and it's consistent with what we know is the experience of a photon in space-time. A photon does not experience time; it does not experience space. So what does that mean? That would mean that it would and if a single photon, which is a wave, a particle wave, a particle following a wave trajectory, if it needs another wave, right? That's the only way to get interference pattern. It has is to have one wave interfere with another wave, to have one wave interact with another wave. That's the only way to get an interference pattern, right? And so if a photon is a definite, discrete thing that really exists, it's not just some quasi thing that exists, in two different slits at once for some reason. I mean, why? Why would why, right? If a photon is heading to one slit, how does it know to split towards the other slit, right? How does it know to do that, right? What's the ontological mechanism by which something which is a singular entity at once and creates a single dot on the screen when you measure it? What's the ontological mechanism that it decides that it should probabilistically split between two slits and interfere in some there's just no explanation for it, right? There's actually literally no explanation for it, right? Whereas if the photons are simply still interacting with other photons, they're just doing it across time, right? Because like I said, right, whatever's happening when a whole bunch of photons go through at one time, and then it's easy to imagine, well, they're just interfering with each other, right? Well, the same thing has to be happening when one photon at a time goes through, right? Because they're not qualitatively different experiments. They're still the same experiment, right? So when one photon at a time is going through and producing the interference pattern, right, must be the same thing happening to the mechanics must be the same to create that interference pattern as when a whole bunch are moving through the slits together at the same time, in which case it's easy, right? So how do you solve that problem? You solve it because photons don't experience time. They're still just interacting with other photons along their vector of travel, which has no time and no space in that space-time configuration, right? That's got to be the explanation. That's got to be the way to do it. That's how you solve quantum mechanics. Now, sure, the statistical methods that they use, because it's actually really hard to measure the state of a quantum particle, right? It's really hard to do that. Sure, the statistical methods where you get the best average, most likely result out of, a million samples, sure, that works, yeah. But we're going now to a deeper level, and we're actually going to explain each quantum event as a definite mechanical process, as a definite mechanical thing, which behaves rationally and discretely, and has a reason for why it behaves and produces the result that it does by itself, and then in aggregate as a statistical result, right? And then it's all solved. You get rid of the spookiness and the probabilism and the meaningless, right? How it all just extends to meaningless, right? Meaninglessness, because a photon goes through two slits probabilistically, that means that existence is meaningless, right? So that's basically how they reason. You don't really get the connection how they do that, but that's what they've done with it, right? Okay, all right, guys, take care, and I'll have another one soon on the nature of the soul and what your soul looks like. I'm going to cover that next. Okay, bye-bye.